This episode of the Better Every Shift podcast is brought to you by Lexipol, the experts in policy, training, wellness support, and grants assistance for first responders and government leaders. To learn more, visit lexipol.com. That's LEXIPOL.com. Now let's get into the show.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Better Every Shift podcast. My name is Aaron Zamzow. Right down below me here, Janelle Fosquet, my co-captain, the engineer, the producer, the brains behind the organization. And I hope you're fired up today because this is an electric episode that we are about to partake in because we have Patrick Durham with us, who is an expert in EVs. He's one of the smartest people I probably know in the fire service. He's a captain and training officer with Troy, Michigan Fire Department. He's a mechanical engineer, and he's currently working on advanced development projects in the automotive industry. Most recently, designing a multi-material battery structure for electric vehicles. And then he started StacheD Training, which I love the name, to educate firefighters on a variety of technical topics, including the unique aspects of responding to electric vehicle fires and electric vehicle incidents. And he had one of the top, I guess, rated. Janelle, what is it? It's one of the highest hits on one of his current
Oh,
articles,
yeah.
correct?
One of the most read articles of all time on Fire Rescue One, or at least of 2022. It was a very, very popular article about electric vehicle fires. We'll put it in the show notes.
Okay, all right. How are you, by the way, Janelle?
I'm great. I'm great.
Good.
I love your electric pun there.
Yeah.
Nice job, Aaron.
Well, welcome, Patrick. I'm super charged up to have you. There's my second
Oh
one.
boy.
So I know
Here
it's
we
going to
go.
get worse. Um, and So thanks again for being here. You are a very smart individual, and you started a training protocol and program based off of, the questions. And let me ask you the first thing. So I'm a brand new lieutenant. I'm sitting in the front seat, and I come up to an EV that's on fire. It's up on the curb. There's power lines that kind of going over the top of it. I'm gonna have you take it from there. What do I do?
I mean, it starts like every other incident. You're going to want to do your 360, your size up, scene safety, all that stuff. But the biggest thing is identify what you have. Know that if it is an EV, um, what make, model, and start start your plan from there. Likely with electric vehicles, you really need to refer to some type of outside guide. It's unfortunate. It's not like a standard vehicle fire where you just put water on it, and put it out. But you need to start getting into the ERGs, emergency response guides that the manufacturers are putting out, and start getting some information from those. Also, you need to know what's on fire. Is the high voltage battery on fire? Because that's really where the hazard is, and that's what departments are really struggling with. Or is it just something on the interior caught on fire? Maybe somebody dropped a cigarette in the upholstery, and at that point, if that high voltage battery is not involved, it's a standard vehicle fire. A couple hundred
Mhm.
gallons of water and should go out pretty easily.
Yeah. So we shouldn't automatically assume, hey, this is automatically the battery is on fire. What are the differences? How can we tell that it is that battery that's uh creating the hazard?
Usually, you see some type of I call it a blowtorch effect. You've got fire kind of shooting out of the bottom side of the vehicle. It seems a little more natural from what we're used to seeing on vehicle fires.
Okay. So I come up, it's shooting out. Obviously it's gonna start the rest of the car on fire. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Like, and I read your piece. I've been reading a lot of your articles because this is something I think, it's my question. I think is probably a lot of us are hopefully listening to this, going, "Yeah, okay, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more," because it goes through our heads, right? So let's say we do establish that it is a battery that's on fire. Then what are our options?
Ultimately, your best option, the quickest option, will likely be let it burn. They say if you can get it, let's say there's no exposures there, you can let it burn. They say it should take an hour, hour and a half. It will burn through all the material in the battery, and then you can put it out like a traditional vehicle fire, a couple hundred gallons of water, little mop up, and you're done. It's really unfortunate because you see the case studies out there. You see the departments really struggling with the batteries. 4, 6, 8 hours on scene. The battery keeps reigniting. Um, Ultimately, the end goal is pretty much, or the end result is pretty much the same. The vehicle's already burned through the battery itself. For a public perspective, the public looks at it. They see the fire department standing there watching the vehicle burn, and you're kind of screwed either way. They look at you and say, "Well, why aren't they doing anything?" But on the flip side of that, you sit there with a vehicle, it's burning for those 4, 6, 8 hours. The public's driving by saying, "Well, why can't this fire department put out a vehicle fire?" So
Yeah.
we're kind of in a tough situation.
Yeah, which we're not very good with, which I
No.
know, and that's why you've obviously been really, really busy the last couple years, based on your knowledge. And so let's talk about that a little bit. So you're a mechanical engineer, and then you've also worked with the automotive industry for how long now?
So I started in advanced development probably 2000, we'll call it 2010, so 13 years now. So I've been working in different areas of the vehicle, and just most recently, a lot more focused on the electric vehicle side of things.
Were you in fire first, or were you an engineer first?
I actually started about the same time. So right out of college, I bought my first house. I lived a block away from the fire department, and I knew it was a volunteer at the time, and I just kept saying, I should go down there and figure out how to join. I had no idea. And one day, my wife just told me, just walk down there, talk to them, figure out how to join this thing, and get it over with. So I've been doing that ever since. So I
Yeah.
joined the fire service in 2006, and yeah, I love it.
And so now you're able to kind of combine, hey, I know a little bit about this and a little bit about this and bring it together for us to teach us. What are the biggest questions that you're getting out there? Because I know that there are, I don't want to say gimmicks, but there are like, hey, there's other things that people are coming up with that from, I think, what, curtains, blankets, penetrating nozzles. Uh, Go through those with me a little bit. Are those effective, or are they promising, or kind of
Yeah, so there are definitely a number of different things. I'd say I'll start with the foams. The biggest issue is the battery cells themselves. They it's a chemical reaction. It doesn't require oxygen to burn. So once
okay?
you understand that fact, it's a very hot chemical reaction, exothermic reaction. Um,
So it doesn't like that. That's something that's hard for us to comprehend because we're always taught about, right? Like
right,
you
right.
take away oxygen, there it goes. But so in this case, everything is enclosed within that battery and it's creating its own oxygen, correct?
Yeah, yep. And actually, I have a cell right here. So this is from some of the early Teslas. It's an 18650 battery. They still sell them in, for consumer electronics and that type of thing. Tesla's since gone to a larger cell. Um, it's a bit bigger than a D size battery, but they're all essentially built the same way. Layers of material inside of here, and UL's done a lot of testing on this. And from the UL studies, when this thing fails, again, it gives off a lot of heat, about 6 liters of gas out of this little thing, 4,400 psi at about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh,
So a lot of
jeez.
heat comes out of that. Now you put thousands of these inside of a battery box, and that battery box is watertight and it's fire resistant by design. So now you've got this thing burning in this watertight, fireproof box, and how do you, even if you had this magic solution to put out the fire or stop the fire, how do you get that material inside the box to actually take care of that? And that's where a lot of the challenges are. I know there are some foams out there that may work great when the battery cells are, out on a table, maybe a manufacturing facility, something like that.
Hmm.
But again, you get that inside the watertight, fireproof box. It's really challenging. You start looking at like the piercing nozzles. Every single manufacturer says do not pierce our battery box. So now you slide this thing under, you pierce it. Let's say somebody does get hurt. Okay, where does the liability fall at that point? That's
Hmm.
my concern, especially being an officer at that point. Somebody gets hurt due to this. But also, you start looking at the way these boxes are designed, and likely if you pierce the wrong spot, you're going to cause more damage and more fire in that area. And then you look at something like the Tesla Model Y, where that battery box, not only is it watertight, fireproof, it's completely filled up with polyurethane foam. So if you were to pierce that box, now the water has nowhere to go other than in and straight back out.
Yeah.
So there's some challenges there.
Yeah, it's so each one of these cells are on top of each other, and they just keep right. Like they obviously get the cell next to it to a
Yep.
temperature where that starts the reaction, and then it's uncontrollable from our standpoint. What about like the big curtains that go over top or blankets? I know that was big. I think overseas is that something probably the
Yes.
same reason, right?
Yeah. So because they don't require oxygen to burn, you can't really smother them. I think those blankets, the fire blankets, have some merit for like exposure protection. Maybe you're in a parking garage, you're on a ferry that's going across the water, wherever you may be. Maybe you're in a garage, you just need some time, buy some time where you can get a tow truck there to get it out of that garage. But on the flip side of that, one of the big components that these batteries off gas is hydrogen. So you've got this flammable gas you're now trapping under this blanket, and you have a very high potential. If you lift this blanket up, you still have the heat source. Now you have a fairly energetic fire event.
Mm. By lifting that blanket up. So
Correct.
that
You
could
just
explode it could explode as we're taking that thing off.
potentially, yes.
So is that like the equivalent of, breaking a window on a structure fire, introducing oxygen,
A-
creating
Absolutely. Or if you're at
got
a
it.
natural gas incident and you get that perfect mixture inside the house, and thermostat clicks, or whatever, you flip a light switch, that type of thing. But with
Got it.
this, the heat source is already there.
So I have a
Okay.
question about when you were talking earlier about kind of just dumping the water on and it keeps reigniting. So the idea is that it's a 6 to 8 hour battle because it just keeps reigniting because you don't give it the opportunity to just burn out, right?
Correct.
And that's why
Correct.
the resources are used. Now, if you have the blanket and you don't remove the blanket and it's really just for exposure protection, will it go out in the same amount of time as it would if you just let it burn?
That one I'm not 100% sure on. I would expect it would still, probably take that hour, an hour and a half. I don't see a whole lot of cooling effect from the blanket, especially inside the box itself. It's still
Hmm.
going to be doing what it's doing. Um, Another thing to consider when you start talking about these cells is, each chemistry is a little bit different on these. Um, and relatively speaking, when you're talking about temperatures in the fire service, the failure temperature is relatively low. So some of these chemistries for these batteries, they'll fail at about 300 degrees Fahrenheit.
Hmm.
Others could be a little bit higher, closer to 500, but there's a wide range um, to that right now. And until they come up with safer chemistries to where they don't fail at those lower temperatures, that's where we have some problems.
So then another option is what about this is a kind of a funny one sometimes, I think, but submerging vehicles, same thing, right? That it's still within that battery, right?
Yeah. So
That encased battery pack.
right, and that's they do that in Europe. They've got these large things that look like 40-yard dumpsters. I think I seen they started selling them here as well in the
Yeah.
States. A lot of the manufacturers and the ERGs say that they don't want their vehicles submerged. And, once you submerge that vehicle, it's causing some other issues, and it's still going to be off gassing. And potentially, how long do you have to leave that in the water before it's safe to pull it out? You look at what happened with Hurricane Ian. All those vehicles got caught up in the storm surge. They were flooded out, and I think they had about 15, 20, somewhere in there. But they had a number of vehicles that caught on fire after the floodwaters receded.
Yeah.
All right,
So
some
yeah.
question here. How does the submerging help anything? I mean, what's the scenario in which you're like, "Oh, this car is on fire. Let's submerge it."
So I think if you look at an individual cell, and I know they're doing this in some of the manufacturing facilities, they've got all these cells, maybe a smaller block of them on a table, and they're doing a test. if something happens inside their manufacturing facility, they take that and they slide into a barrel full of water, and that water
Oh,
acts as
okay.
a buffer and it can absorb the energy, absorb the heat, and keep it from being so energetic.
Okay. So this isn't like out in the world tactics here. This is this is
Uh,
Right.
back at the
it,
facility.
It
yeah, it is.
depends, right?
Yeah, it is in Europe. They definitely have some systems set up that way, and they are, from my knowledge, they are selling a system in the U.S. now, that's set up for that. But on the other side of it too, now you've got this big container full of water. You just left the vehicle in there for, who knows how long. You take the vehicle out. What do you do with that water? I
Yeah.
can't imagine you can just dump it down the storm drain at that point and let it run back, into the
Yeah.
Yeah, good
system.
point.
Right. And that's the big thing with fighting these fires with 30,000 gallons of water. That water's got to go somewhere, and now it's
Right.
contaminated. Um, do you think educating the general population on this is a good thing to do for a fire department? Is it, if I'm a PIO, do I need to start thinking about, hey, these EV fires, there's not much we can do? Like what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think it's important that the public knows what's going on, not only from an electric vehicle standpoint, but also start looking at, even your consumer electronics. There's a lot of e-bike fires, scooter fires. I know in Michigan, I think there was an e-bike that caught a historic home on fire up in Mackinac Island.
Hmm.
They had an electric wheelchair that caught on fire in Ann Arbor, Michigan, caused some damage. So just letting the public know that you've got to be careful charging these things, and you've got to be careful if the batteries are damaged or if you're buying cheap batteries like replacement batteries, non-UL certified. You're trying to charge them with the incorrect charger. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with those. I just saw a video just the other day of a dog chewing on some type of lithium-ion battery that lit off in the home,
Yeah.
and caught the car. I don't know the end result of that, but things like that happen, and just weird stuff.
Yeah, and I think I did see that. It's kind of a viral video that's going on.
Right.
I saw one, I think, downtown New York, where like a e-bike fell over and it started shooting sparks, and um, and this is becoming more and more common in my area of here in Madison. We had a couple of fires, like laptop batteries that were secondhand or bought from, like you were saying, probably cheap knockoffs. And that's going to be obviously more and more popular and common, and that can start a lot of different things. You were just telling us like a story about at a hotel, correct? Like someone
Yep.
was
Yeah, he was a
what?
commercial drone operator, and he had his battery pack sitting on the spare queen size bed in his hotel room, and that lit off. Luckily, it ended up being a fairly minor fire, but it definitely had some potential to be a big ordeal.
My God, yeah. So what's failing in these batteries? Like why are we getting fires? What happens? Let's look at the EV. So the EV, I know there's probably a combination thing. So accidents obviously um, can cause the breakdown of the battery. We know that. What other things are you seeing that are happening? Either whether they're charging or
A,
you
a
know.
lot of it, what I'm seeing, is manufacturer defects of some sort, some type or another. You look at the Chevy Bolt, for example, massive recall, and that was brought back to a manufacturing defect, and that was, the batteries were catching on fire while they were charging. You think about where people charge their cars, that ends up being a much bigger issue for us.
Yeah.
But even Ford just had a recent thing. They stopped production on the Ford Lightning because they had one of their vehicles. It didn't make it out to a customer, but on their end of line testing, they had a fire that shut down production for a little bit while they were trying to, to solve the or figure out what went wrong and make sure a vehicle like that doesn't make it out to a customer.
Hmm.
Um, Aside from that, you see a lot of it with damage. Um, some of the original designs, you run over something on the roadway, you get a really good impact underneath the vehicle. Depending on what hit the vehicle or what hit the bottom of that battery case, you could either have a fire right away. If something penetrates the battery case, you're probably going to have a fire right then and there, or the issue just kind of festers, and road vibration and everything else with driving. You have a fire a week later, a month later, you just don't really know.
Yeah. Snow. Can that, I mean, excessive temperature, hot to cold, snow,
Well,
uh, piece of
right.
ice?
What concerns me more with the snow is the salt on the roads. Um, a lot of these vehicles, if they get that salt spray, eventually they rust through. We're not talking new vehicles, but what happens 5, 10 years down the road.
Right, right. How old is the, oldest EV that we have out there, by the way? Where are we about that 5, 6 year mark?
Uh, it's hard to say because you look at the number of EVs on the road, there aren't a lot of old EVs on the road, in my opinion.
Mhm.
I know the stats for Michigan specifically, 2021, we had about 17,500 registered in the state. But you go back 5 years from there, from 2021, and it was like 2,000. So there's been a big uptick in EV sales. A lot of them are out on the coast. Obviously, Tesla started with the Roadster in 2008. The Chevy Volt came out in 2010.
Mhm.
Um, so it just depends on where you're looking, and a lot of quantity.
I've got
Yeah,
a
and
question to go back to something you mentioned at the very beginning about, when Aaron posed the question about you roll up on the scene, you've got an EV fire, what do you do? And you were talking about, this is where the manufacturer guidelines, recommendations, emergency response guidelines come into play. But at the end of the day, if it's a Tesla or a Chevy Bolt, is there any difference in how a firefighter is going to approach that?
On the fire side, probably not so much. It's good to know where the battery is, the size of the battery. Especially most of the newer vehicles are very similar in size and shape. Those batteries are very large underneath the vehicle. Some of the older ones might be a little bit different. I think the emergency response guide, realistically, is probably more important when you start talking about, accidents, extrication, or other types of incidents.
Got it. Got it.
yeah, what's the guide you recommend for that?
So each manufacturer has their own emergency response guide for each model year vehicle they
Okay.
have. Some OEMs are better, some manufacturers are better than others at providing those. GM's done a fantastic job getting those documents out, getting them to NFPA hosts a spot on their site that has a whole list of vehicles and the different ERGs. Other manufacturers haven't been doing as good of a job. Unfortunately, there's an ISO standard out there for the ERGs, but not every manufacturer is using it right now. Some of these ERGs are 30, 40 pages in length.
Yeah.
The ISO
Yeah.
standard, I believe, is 4 pages.
Okay.
So it's a much better guide for first responders when we get on scene.
Is there an app
Uh, so
for all these?
so there's no real specific app for it right now. There's some companies out there um, that have all these details in them. The Euro Rescue app is a free app you can get on your phone. It was developed in Europe, and it might not have all the vehicles over here. It doesn't have
Mhm.
a lot of great information in it.
Yeah. So someone's better off just, "Hey, Google this real quick," as you're.
Realistically, it's
Okay.
unfortunate to say you got to roll up on scene and consult Google, but again, there are software pieces of software out there that you can purchase yearly that have a lot of great information and have all this information without naming names. But
Right.
you
Right.
know,
I
Well,
was
hopefully they can.
curious. So Aaron had asked about, what was causing the EV fires, right? It's the accidents. But can we pivot that over to just the lithium ion batteries in general, like the example you shared with the hotel, you know, with the drone operator, what's causing that fire?
yeah,
And
that
what's the catalyst for most of these
Mm.
consumer electronic fires?
yeah, that one's likely charging. Um, that one specifically, I don't know all the details on the exact cause or what they found out. But a lot of the time, these batteries are being charged, and uh, I mentioned earlier the temperature for these things, is relatively low, like 300 degrees, for it to go into a thermal runaway or for that cell to fail. Think of it, you're trying to charge these batteries very quickly, and think of it like your SCBA bottle. If you put your SCBA in the cascade and you crank that valve wide open, as it fills up, you're going to get to your 4,500 psi or whatever your psi is. But when you take that bottle out, it's really hot, right?
Yep.
It's the
Yep.
same thing with these batteries. You're trying to dump a lot of energy into this battery cell to charge it up as fast as you can charge it up. And when that happens, it just reaches that point where it fails, especially if you're
And
not using the right charger or modified charger, or maybe there's some type of damage in there.
yeah, what usually fails? Is it the barrier between, um, between like, so I know like that there are, I've heard in some of my minor research that usually like it's usually like a knockoff part, or it's poor quality within the battery itself that can fail.
Right. There's really thin films in there, and it doesn't matter if it's your pouch style, like what you'd see in a laptop or a cell phone, or that cylindrical style that I was just holding up. It's very thin layers, and they're either layered on top of each other, or they're layered on top of each other, then just all coiled up in a round circle or cylinder to fit in that tube. So one of those layers breaks down, you get contact where it's not supposed to be contact, and it starts reacting.
And that just all of a sudden causes more heat, and then from there, the
Right.
rest just kinda goes into, thermal runway, correct? Or
Thermal runaway, yes.
runaway, yeah.
And the thermal runaway is really when one cell fails, and then the ones around it fail, and the ones around those fail.
And so then going back to the initial scenario that we were talking about, you figure out what EV you're dealing with. You got an option to probably one of our crew members Google it. The biggest thing is that you had mentioned exposure protection in this case, right? Like
Right.
protect everything around it. Usually it takes an hour to an hour and a half. Does that so if a battery is more charged, does it burn longer as opposed to one that's not?
I don't know the specifics on that. I think there's a lot of testing that needs to be done on EVs and a lot to still explore in that area. I do know if the batteries are at full charge, it's more energetic when they fail than like half charged or 25% charged, because you got to think of the energy stored inside of that
Mhm.
device. Um, but yeah, as far as length of time, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. So really, unfortunately, like this is what we don't like as firefighters. We don't have a solution for something, and water doesn't solve it, or foam, or taking the oxygen away. So,
Right.
right, like, how many conversations do you have? You probably have daily conversations where we're like, "Well, tell me what we can do," and letting it burn is just not in our vocabulary, is it?
Right.
You know?
Right.
So
No,
so
and I've sat on fires, and probably a couple years ago, I sat on three vehicles in a parking lot that burned for. I think we were there for 2 hours waiting for. There's power lines on them. You're waiting for 2 hours for the power company to get there, shut off the power. It's painful just sitting there watching something burn and
yeah,
not being able to do our job. Right? We
yeah.
want to do something. We want to be involved, fix the problem. But it's tough when you don't have that answer.
But maybe you can
Yeah,
just pivot towards, okay, maybe you can't put out the fire, but you can protect the exposures.
Right.
Focus on what you can do.
yeah, yeah,
Right. And I always tell people, if you've got, for example, a car in a garage on fire, get that tow truck there, use a utility, a winch on a utility. Maybe you got a winch on your rescue. Get that vehicle drug out of the garage, get it out in the driveway away from those exposures. Let it do its thing there, and then focus on your structure fire. Get the exposure put out.
yeah. So let's talk about that scenario a little bit where you obviously need to be SCBA, wearing your SCBA anywhere near
Yep.
these, correct?
Yep.
And full PPE. But you have, let's say we have an EV fire. Now I'm coming up on the scene. We got an EV, open garage. Um, right now we can tell it's a battery that's on fire. Next step is, as you said, try to get something there to be able to drag it out of that
Yeah, if I
if
had
you
a
can.
car in a garage, I'd be putting a lot of water in there until I could get something there to get it out. But ideally, get somebody coming very quickly to hook onto a wheel or axle or whatever you can hook onto, piece of suspension to rip that vehicle out of the garage.
Okay. Is this something you would recommend departments to look at, a local towing company and hooking up? There's another pun. Sorry, you guys. Hooking up with them to do some training on this?
I think so, and I think you need to have a good working relationship with your tow company anyway, because once you start talking about EVs in general, they've got to be towed on a flatbed. When you get that vehicle to the salvage yard or the tow yard, they can't store it inside. They've got to store it away from any exposure, at least 50 feet away from any exposure, depending on the size of the vehicle. um, that's an area where there's a little bit of concern. You get these departments where maybe you've got a fatality and you have no fire, but you had an accident, you got a fatality, but now you've got this damaged EV there. They want to take it back. Police, it's now a crime scene, it's now evidence, so police has they have their own special spot they want to store it. In some of these departments, they want to have it stored inside. It's like you can't do that with an
Can't
electric
do that.
vehicle.
Okay. Yeah. And even on that scenario where you got, where where you don't see any visible fire, in a fatality accident, should we be wearing our SCBA on those?
uh, when I talk about extrication, I think that's an area that's really overlooked when you talk about the fire service and EVs. Everybody focuses on the fire side of it. I think there's a real potential that you're going to be doing an extrication in full SCBA, full PP and SCBA, because you could have crews up there working, and you could have a situation where you start, getting eye, throat, nose irritation, because that battery starts off gassing,
Mhm.
and that's not a good thing for firefighters to be breathing in. Um, it's definitely not a good thing for the patient. So maybe you have to get maybe your vent fan out and blow some fresh air through the vehicle compartment. Um, but there's a lot of differences there. The other side of that, when you start talking about extrication, these fires are very energetic when those batteries let loose. I know most departments, they have in their SOPs that you should have a charged hose line ready to go at an extrication, right? But
Yep.
realistically, how often does that happen? Every extrication, probably not. Maybe it gets pulled, it never gets charged. But with EVs, you really should have somebody staffing that hose line and ready to go in case that battery does fail.
I'm also thinking about this scenario with going back to the tow truck and working with tow truck companies. Again, you gotta look at what's burning, getting that car out of a garage or out of a situation, and then it still goes further. Like, you need to communicate with that tow truck company, like, this is still not safe. And you'd mentioned that if we're there and we're doing education, some of the symptoms again for that, like if members start to cough, or if what are we smelling or seeing, and what some of the things that we should look out for if we're doing education for safety.
Yeah, if you see an actual visible vapor cloud, you're probably going to have a fire very soon. But if you start just getting that eye or throat, nose irritation, um, at that point, you really should pull back and get your SCBA on.
Okay. A- And then uh, anything else with that, like people start coughing, people start feeling that. You said you can kind of see something. You'd be able to see a little bit of a cloud, or
Potentially,
possibly,
you
right?
could see a vapor cloud coming out. But if
Okay.
you get that much material coming out, or you see that something that visible, you're probably going to have a fire within seconds.
Okay. So that's also telling us you need your SCBA and you need to get the heck out of that area as well.
Right.
So if there's a patient or something in there, let's do what we can to get them out.
Absolutely. Or
Okay.
or protect them if you can't get them out. You know, keep them cool, and it's not going to be a great situation, unfortunately.
So I got a question kind of related to this, and this is one that my crew wanted me to ask. And a member of my crew has really taken this on himself to educate all of us on the crew and everyone around us. He does, and I think that's what every department needs, right? They need that person to spearhead, try to figure out, talk to people like yourself. But he had a question about the charging stations that are located in like grocery stores and um, shopping malls, and you see them popping up everywhere. Do those Are they supposed to have a safety shut off? And what are our risks when you got an EV charging in that charging station and there's still power going to it? Like, what do we do there?
Yeah, so the charging stations themselves, there's different levels of chargers, but the large ones, level three chargers, for example, those are 480 volts, very large three-phase power. For those that know, electricity.
Mhm.
Um, Ideally, if something's going on involving a charging station, you need to find the main switchgear, the main disconnect, and get power shut off to it. And then once power's shut off to it, you want to treat that like any type of charge transformer or piece of high voltage electrical equipment. But unfortunately, to make things more complicated, a lot of these newer chargers are starting to come their ESS systems, so their energy storage systems, and they have lithium ion batteries built into the system itself. So now you've got a charger, and it also has lithium ion batteries inside of it. So that could create more of a challenge.
Yeah. And is there a universal like shut off for all of them, or is it every system is probably a little bit different, right? Like you gotta, when you're driving around these things, I hope one of the takeaways for this is our members and listeners are like, shoot, let's figure that out now, right? Let's figure what we
Right.
have in our territories, right?
And it's
And
not
look for.
just I would say it's not just the commercial chargers either, because you've got these residential chargers, which are typically a level 2 charger, 220-volt. But you look at, for example, the Ford Lightning, they require a 220-volt dedicated 100-amp service for that charger. Just to give some rough numbers for people that really don't know power, a lot of your older homes are 100-amp service just for the house
Mhm.
itself, and then you look at a newer home, they're typically about 200 amps. So half your power is going directly to the charger itself.
And then could be a different shut off, correct? I mean,
Absolutely.
it it should be one shut off, but there could be a separate one for just the EV system, correct? In
Yes,
certain cases,
there
yeah.
should be,
Okay, there should
depending on
be.
depending on who installed it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my god. Okay, so it all comes back to start creating some relationships with those companies that are involved, tow truck companies, getting to know your territory and understanding that these hazards are there. And, we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable at a scene where we can't necessarily just put water on it, solve every problem. Right. Like,
Yep.
um, you know, this is probably going to be one of the most unliked podcasts, but hopefully most listened to because this is stuff that we are totally against. It goes against what we do, right? As firefighters, you
Right,
know,
we like to solve the problem, and unfortunately sometimes that's just time.
yeah, and
Time.
like
Yeah.
time, which brings us to it's a time for we like to do hot seat questions. So we've been so serious in this, or I have because I've been I've been dominating these questions because this is I hope every firefighter is behind me going, yeah, these are good because this is what we need to know. But we'll kind of loosen up a little bit. We like to throw these different questions at our guests, and I have one probably pertains to this a little bit, but as a fire officer, what's your favorite drill for your crews?
So I like time drills. It's very difficult to get any sense of urgency when you're talking about training, and it's hard to get that stress level. The stress level we feel when we feel on scene. So I like to do time drills where one of my favorite is having the engine pull up, have that engineer hop off the engine, get everything in pump, pull the cross lay, and time stops when the hose line's charged. That's
Okay.
probably one of my favorite ones.
And you'll
I
just
like it.
randomly go up someplace, right? Like, hey, let's do that
We
drill.
we'll do it behind the station. We got a hydrant back there, so we can practice hooking into the hydrant as well. So it works out great.
Cool. Love
Awesome.
it.
All right. So, what's your most memorable call? Like one that comes to mind anytime anyone asks you about being a firefighter, the one that really kind of fires you up.
Um, my most memorable is more on the humor side. We had a flood back in 2014, I think it was, and for whatever reason we were in this waist deep water, and we're going over these cars that are kind of bobbing in the water, and we're picking people out of these cars through the window. And this lady crawls out of her window into my arms, and I'm carrying her through the water. And my buddy goes to the other door, and he just looks at her and says, "You're gonna get wet," and rips open the door and just floods the inside of the car, and walked back with her because just the way it worked out.
Yeah, I think you're gonna get wet in that situation for
You're gonna
sure.
get wet in this situation. And
Yep.
thank God those weren't EVs. Not now what
Right.
do you do, right?
Right.
Not to throw
Uh,
a little
on,
twist to this,
on the
but
plus side, as far as like electrical hazard, they say they're safe in flooded water, so that's a good side thing.
yeah, except
But
for salt water for a long period of time.
well, I think any water in a long period of time, they'll eventually catch on fire.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So which, this just comes back to like, all right, so at least we got everybody out, but all of a sudden, if that water doesn't subside, you got 4 or 5 EVs, all of a sudden they're going, like, right. Like,
Yep.
man, we're going to we could do like 4 different episodes on scenarios and EVs. So, but speaking of that, like you're a car guy, you've done some research on them, you know your stuff. What's your dream car? Now it can be new, it can be old. Like, I'm sure you have a little bit of insight into what's coming out also. So
I hate to say it, but my dream car is just a pickup truck. So nothing too fancy, something I can haul stuff around in.
a special year, like an old 74 Chevy or a C10 or whatever those are.
I actually like the 50s F100s.
Okay. With the flare outs
Yeah,
in the back. Yeah.
still have some curve to the body.
Yep. Yep. I'm with you on that one too. I actually my dream is to have like a red one, with a little fire department logo on it or something.
Yeah,
I don't know. Yep. Drive
little
around with
bubble
my
light on
dog.
top.
Yeah. Yeah. Have my dog in the seat next to me, just wagging with his head out the window. Something relaxing about that whole vision. I don't know. I thought you were gonna go like an EV dream car or something, like the
Eh,
Batmobile or something like that, right? Like, um, something really, really cool. Which the Batmobile we established behind the scenes is not an EV, by the way,
no.
just for those, right? You know, um, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And we try to just be as informative as possible, but right, you could just see how one question sparked another question, sparked another question, sparked another question, and I think I just tapped the surface of scenarios and questions. But hopefully, our listeners, I think, to summarize, right? Like, what would you want people to take from this whole podcast, Patrick? Just about what we talked about a ton, but to summarize it, what do you tell that person, when you get that EV fire or uh, you know, uh,
Yeah, I think like any incident we go to, just stay calm. Think through the situation, realize what's going on, and try to have an understanding of why you have to sit there and wait. And on the other side of that, be able to explain that maybe to the chief later on if they're not as well informed.
and then one last question on this: what are you seeing the manufacturers doing um, on their side to help uh, the first responder side?
Yeah, unfortunately, the biggest thing I'm seeing is the emergency response guides, and that's not a lot. I think there needs to be work done on the design side to change that. They are throwing billions of dollars at the battery chemistry, and I think eventually that battery chemistry will be what saves this technology and makes it a lot safer. Unfortunately, when the battery technology does change, we're going to have a lot of legacy products on the road still, or out in the world. So that's where things can still be a little bit more difficult.
I think you said everything that we are all thinking, that we know that we're going to have to be patient. There is no, silver bullet. There's no special, gimmick or particular thing that can help us. In these situations, just make sure. I love the fact you said, "Hey, just stay calm." Even though we don't have a solution, we still know everything around it. We can control what we can control. So awesome
Yeah,
stuff. Thank you.
I was gonna say these things don't just generally, spontaneously combust in the middle of the road. Generally something, you know, catastrophic has happened aside from the manufacturer defects of it. But we also know when we respond to things, we're going to something that just catastrophically failed or crashed or something happened out of the ordinary.
Uh, Patrick, again, thanks so much for your knowledge and for taking the time. And I'm sure we'll probably have tons more questions from our audience, and hopefully we can get those addressed and answered. And you're welcome back anytime, especially if you find that solution that we're all looking for. But other than that, keep doing what you're doing and educating us on this topic because it's definitely needed.
No,
Um,
thanks for having me.
Awesome. Most importantly, to everyone else listening, learn something, do something, share something to make you and those around you better every shift. Thanks for listening, everybody.